Matthew 16. A lot of good stuff here, and actually it is not according to our regular schedule for us to take more than the first 12 verses in any particular one class, but the first 12 verses were supposed to be covered along with the previous material. We didn't get around to it. So I'm hoping to cover those 12 verses and then go on. The problem is the material that comes immediately after those 12 verses, beginning, of course, at verse 13, is very, very significant, and there's a great deal that could be said about it. So I don't know how far we'll get. We'll get through verse 12 certainly, and then if we get into the next portion, I don't think we'll get all the way through it. So we'll just kind of see how we do. Chapter 16, verse 1. Then the Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, "When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And he left them and departed. Now, let's talk about that before we read any further. Jesus, of course, had just fed, most recently, had just fed the 4,000, the multitudes. And not too long earlier, had fed 5,000. And when we give those numbers, we're simply giving the numbers of the males, of adult males, so we don't know what number those figures might have swelled to if you included the women and children in the figuring. But obviously it was quite large. The people who were present were duly impressed that a miracle had been performed. From clearly inadequate supplies, Jesus had filled everybody's stomachs completely until they were actually full, the Bible says. He had also, not too long earlier, in chapter 15, healed a great number of sick people and maimed people, and there was a great astonishment on the part of the onlookers. So it seems really unreasonable for the Pharisees and Sadducees to come and say, "Show us a sign from heaven." Now, perhaps the operational phrase here is "from heaven." They had seen signs enough, one might think. But when they asked for a sign from heaven, perhaps they were thinking along the lines of what Elijah had done, calling fire out of heaven. Or what Joshua had done in making the heavens, the sun stand still in the midst of the heavens. Or even, as they had requested after he fed the 5,000, that he might give them manna from heaven, as Moses had done. You see, the Pharisees and Sadducees felt, or at least the Pharisees did, I don't know about the Sadducees on this, but the Pharisees felt that signs on earth, things like healing and feeding multitudes and things like that, those possibly could be tricks. They could even be counterfeits from the devil. We know that Jesus was accused of casting out demons by the power of the devil, but it was argued that anything that came down from heaven would clearly be from God, and therefore they were wanting a sign of a different sort than he had given so far. Jesus had not caused the sun to turn black or the moon to turn to blood or anything like that to happen. And therefore, apparently they were asking him for a sign which they were implying would be indisputably from God. One that came down from heaven, where God was perceived as living. Now, Jesus called these people hypocrites. He said, "You do know how to read signs from heaven, don't you? When you look up into the sky, and you see in the evening that the sky is red, you know that that's an indicator that the weather's going to be better the next day. But if the sky is red in the morning, you deduce that the weather's going to be bad that day." In other words, that's actually quite common knowledge even now. I mean, perhaps not an infallible gauge, but in terms of norms and likelihoods and probabilities, that's still a pretty good way of determining what the weather's going to be like in the immediate future. And Jesus noticed that even back then, 2,000 years before our own time, people had already observed these patterns. They had come to know how to look at the sky and make some predictions about the immediate weather that was to be expected that day or the next day. And so they were accustomed to looking at the sky, looking at the heavens for signs. But the trouble is they needed to notice the signs that were going around on earth. And they were being hypocritical. Jesus said they were hypocrites, which means that they weren't really being honest. It's not as if they needed that kind of a sign from heaven to prove that what he was doing was from God. They should have been able to tell just by the character of his works that he was from God, and that he was doing the very works which the Old Testament prophets said the Messiah would do. This is why he called his works the signs of the times. That is, the things he was doing were not signs from heaven in the sense that they were visibly proceeding from heaven to earth, like fire out of heaven, but they were the very signs that were to be associated with the times of the Messiah. We know that when John the Baptist had earlier sent messengers from his prison cell to ask Jesus if he was the one who was to come or should they look for another, Jesus sent back this message: well, you go tell John what you see. The deaf hear, the blind see, the dumb speak, the lame are healed, the gospel is preached to the poor, and blessed is he who is not stumbled by me. Now, what was he saying? He was saying, you decide. You're asking if I'm the Messiah or not, you decide. Here's the evidence, here's what's happening, here's the signs. Can you read them? Now, how could anyone read them? How could anyone know for sure that these were the signs of the Messianic age? There had been, after all, miracles earlier in Israel's history. Elijah and Elisha had done miracles. Moses had done miracles. However, there was no one who had done miracles in such a wholesale and widespread manner. I mean, you have a few miracles in the life of Elijah. Notable ones, no doubt, and even some of them were signs from heaven. Stopping the rain, starting the rain with prayers, calling fire out of heaven. But those miracles were mainly signs to authorize the prophet himself. They were not necessarily signs that were practically beneficial to anybody. Jesus' miracles were acts of compassion. He didn't do anything just to be on display. He didn't do anything just to prove to people that he was powerful. He did things because the things he did, people needed to be done. People were sick and they got healed. People were demon-possessed, they got delivered. People were dead and they were raised. They were hungry and they got fed. Jesus was not a carnival magician. He didn't do things just to cause people to marvel. In fact, he did everything he could to keep the astonishment level down. When he saw crowds gathering, he quickly would do a miracle to keep it from being too much of a public spectacle before the crowds all got there. He'd tell people, don't tell anyone about this. It's clear that Jesus never saw his miracles as first and foremost his way of proving who he was. Although he later, when he was challenged on who he was, he did appeal to his miracles and say, listen, you've seen what I do. That should tell you something. But his reason for doing miracles that is given again and again in the Bible is he was moved with compassion. He was moved with compassion. He healed them. He was moved with compassion and he helped them. And even that's why he said, before he fed the multitudes, he said to his disciples, I have compassion on the multitudes. I'm afraid they're going to leave. They've been around for 3 days. They'll go and faint for hunger. I mean, when he did miracles, he did things that were practical and useful, not things that were just theatrical and dramatic. Now, what the scribes and Pharisees, or the Pharisees and Sadducees, were here asking for was an impractical demonstration of power that would simply validate his claims to be the Messiah. And they thought, that would prove something. I mean, after all, Moses had done some not altogether practical things, just for the sake of proving authority. For instance, taking Aaron's rod, along with that of Korah and his companions, and seeing which rod would bud. Well, the budding of Aaron's rod didn't really meet any physical, practical needs of anybody, but did validate Aaron as God's choice. And Elijah's calling fire from heaven did a similar thing. They came after him and said, man of God, the king commands you to come down. He said, well, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down out of heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And it did. So, I mean, these kinds of things didn't help anybody except the prophet himself to prove who he was. Jesus wasn't into that kind of showmanship. Not that that was wrong in those cases. There needed to be some kind of validation, and God gave it. But the point here is, Jesus was simply by doing the works of his Father. That is, the kinds of works his compassionate Father would do for suffering people. He didn't need additional demonstrative powers to prove who he was. It should be able to be deduced that a man who does what no human being can do is either acting on authority from God or from the devil. And since the nature of all the miracles were continuously merciful and benevolent and so forth and compassionate, it should make it clear whether it's the devil or God that they're coming from. And so he's basically saying, you're hypocrites. You're sign seekers, but you've seen plenty of signs, and you're not going to get any more signs. In fact, the only sign I'm going to give this generation is the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he had already explained what that was, so he doesn't explain it here. Back in chapter 12, he had identified the sign of the prophet Jonah, when on that occasion, too, they were asking for a sign. In the 12th chapter of Matthew, verse 38, some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. And he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now that's exactly what he says here, almost verbatim, in chapter 16, verse 4. But there, in Matthew 12, he explains what he means by the prophet Jonah. He says in verse 40, For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, that was obviously a reference to his death and resurrection, though that's easier for us to understand in that light now that we know about his death and resurrection in retrospect than it would have been evident without people who weren't aware that that was going to happen wouldn't necessarily have been altogether clear on what he was saying. Similar to the time in John chapter 2 when he was asked to give some kind of substantiation of his authority and to give some kind of a sign to prove that he had the authority to cleanse the temple. I'm talking about John chapter 2. Right after he cleansed the temple, he was challenged on his authority. It says in verse 18, The Jews answered and said to him, What sign do you show us since you do these things? In other words, to prove that this really is your Father's house as you claim and that you have the right to drive these people out. What sign can you do to validate yourself? And Jesus answered, John 2:19, Jesus answered and said to them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And we know, of course, from the later comment in verse 21, he was speaking of the temple of his body. So again, he was talking about his 3 days being dead and then rising again. So twice, or 3 times actually, when he was asked by the Jews to give a sign, he said, well, this is the sign I'll give you. He phrased it in different ways, but he said that his death and his resurrection 3 days later was going to be the sign that they would get, and he wasn't going to do any other stupendous signs for them that were not necessarily practically helpful to people. And so we see that whether he's talking about the sign of Jonah or the sign of destroy this temple in 3 days I'll raise it up, both cases he's talking about his 3 days in the heart of the earth, the 3 days of his death followed by his resurrection. Now, both times when Jesus was asked about this, he said, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. It is apparently not a matter of pleasure to God when people are obsessed and intrigued with signs and wonders. There's nothing wrong with wanting to know the supernatural power of God in your life, but to be obsessed with sort of a carnal sort of curiosity, to be entertained by stupendous things, that is not apparently what God is pleased by in such people. Actually, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says in verse 22, For the Jews request a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now, he says the Jews are signs seekers. Paul ought to know he was one of them. He had even been a Pharisee before. He knew the Jewish fascination with signs. If he hadn't known it from his own experience, he would know it from the experience of Jesus, how the Jews were continually asking Jesus, give us a sign, give us a sign. And in particular here, saying a sign from heaven. But he calls them hypocrites. They'd seen enough if they could put 2 and 2 together. If they were really truth seekers, they wouldn't need additional signs. I mean, what more signs could they reasonably ask for than what they had seen? Now, what I want to point out to you in this passage before we go on to the next is there's 2 things right here, and they're somewhat related to each other in a somewhat interesting way. He says in verse 3, Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. He indicates that it's been important enough for them to know the weather that they've learned how to put 2 and 2 together from the present to discover what the weather will be like tomorrow or later today. We usually think that when people talk about the weather, they're talking about trivial matters that don't matter very much. I mean, how's the weather is just a way, or talking about the weather is usually conceived of as a way to just spend time, since, like they say, everybody talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. The weather is one of those things that is almost proverbial as a totally unimportant thing to sit around talking about, since there's absolutely no control that we have over it, to sit around and moan about it or talk about how lovely it is. I mean, it may be worthy of comment occasionally, but to talk at length about the weather is to talk about things of no value to talk about in most cases. Now, even so, the Pharisees cared enough about weather, something of relatively inconsequential weight, to learn how to discover what the weather would be like. No doubt that would have practical value from time to time. But they didn't care enough about the kingdom of God or the Messianic age to have acquainted themselves with the signs of its nearness or presence. It's as if, the weather, as inconsequential as that might be, was more important to them than the Messianic age was, which is the most consequential thing that God has ever talked about or predicted. Now, of course, when Jesus sent word back to John the Baptist, the blind see and all this stuff, he was alluding to prophecies of the Old Testament. He alluded to Isaiah 61, where it says, the Lord has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He says, tell John that the poor have the gospel preached to them. He was alluding to Isaiah 35. It says, the dumb shall speak, and the blind shall see, and the lame shall leap. Jesus made reference to those things actually taking place. Tell John that's happening. What was this but saying, these are signs of the times. You want to know whether there's another coming or whether I'm he? Just see. Didn't God give you certain signs that the Messianic age would be here? Are these not taking place before your eyes? Is it really that hard to see and to deduce what's going on here? Now, the Pharisees were seeing all these same signs too. They were simply refusing to put two and two together in this case. They were refusing to let the evidence lead to the obvious conclusion that this was the Messianic age and Jesus was the Messiah. Why were they so dull of hearing or of seeing? I don't know that we can be sure, but I think it's probably a political thing for them. If Jesus was the Messiah, they clearly were going to lose power because he would be destined to rule, and he wasn't in their circle, and they weren't in his. Therefore, his rise to power would be at the expense of their place of power. And it would appear that was what motivated them. Jesus, in one of his parables, in Matthew 21 or 22, when he talked about the parable of the vineyard and the owner of the vineyard sending his servants, and the tenants of the vineyard beating up the servants, and then finally the owner sent his son to collect the fruit. And he says the tenants of the vineyard said, this is the heir, let us kill him and his inheritance will be ours. And so they killed the son, obviously corresponding to what the Jewish leadership did to Jesus. I mean, there's no question about what Jesus was talking about in that parable. Therefore, he represented the motivation of those who killed him as saying, he's the heir. Let's kill him, and then we can have what would ordinarily be his. Now, what would normally be the Messiah's? But the kingdom itself, the power, the political authority, and so forth. That's what the leaders of the Jews already were enjoying. But if Jesus was going to inherit such things, they weren't going to have them anymore, and only by killing him did they hope to retain them. And therefore they were not willing to accept a Messiah who had not come up through their ranks and did not affirm their values and did not seem to be the type who'd give them positions of power in his kingdom, and who selected as his co-workers men that the Pharisees disdained. This simply did not make them want to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, although the signs were all there. And therefore they were not being truly honest. They had an agenda that prevented them from seeing what should have been obvious to them. That's why Jesus said they were being hypocrites. They weren't really being open and honest and walking in the truth that they could be walking in. And he says, you act as if you're concerned about heavenly things, and yet you're more concerned about the weather in the heavens than you are about the kingdom of the heavens. And if you were as concerned about the kingdom as you are about the weather, you have learned how to discern the signs of the presence of the kingdom, just as you've learned how to discern the nearness of certain kinds of weather. So this is how he attacks them. Now, I want to say something about this. The expression "signs of the times" is an expression that we hear a lot these days. We hear about the signs of the times. I can remember in my own youth as a dispensationalist quoting this verse with reference to our own times. I thought it was extremely important that we should be able to see that the political climate in the world today was a fulfillment of many prophecies about the end times, and that the coming of Christ was near, and that anybody who couldn't see this was, like Jesus said, a hypocrite, not discerning the signs of the times. Well, as you know, I don't think that way anymore. You know what I now think. But the point is, although I changed my views on this years ago, I still marvel because I hear people saying the very same thing. Only a few years ago, I heard an influential local preacher indicate that this verse implicates Christians who are not able to recognize that Jesus' coming is just around the corner, because obviously what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Russia, and what's happening in China, and what's happening in Western Europe, and what's happening in Eastern Europe, all these things are signs of the times. Anyone who can't see it falls under Jesus' condemnation of a hypocrite because they can see in the natural what the weather's going to be like. And in fact, in our day, we have even more sophisticated means to know what the weather's going to be like tomorrow. And yet, if we can't see that the second coming of Christ is upon us, if we can't see the signs all around us, how hypocritical we are and how much we fall under Jesus' censure in this very matter. This verse is used. I have heard, not too long ago, certainly within the last year, radio preachers talking about Bible prophecy, again from a dispensational view, assuming that the coming of the Lord is near and heralded by many current events. I've heard them say, God has commanded us to be aware of the signs of the times. And we are required to be alert to the signs of the times, and so forth. Well, there was a time in my life I wouldn't have questioned that kind of preaching. I thought, well, that sounds right. But I remember hearing that about less than a year ago and thinking, no, wait a minute. Let's have a scripture on that, please. Where does the Bible say we're supposed to be aware of the signs of the times? No verse but this could be used, because this is the only verse in the whole Bible that uses the expression signs of the times. The term is never used of the last days. Certainly Jesus was not talking about the last days. He was talking about his own days. The signs of the times were happening at that moment. That's why the Pharisees and Sadducees were so blameworthy. They couldn't see them. If they weren't happening yet, how could he blame them for not seeing them? It's obvious that when Jesus said, you can't discern the signs of the times, he meant his own times. The inbreaking of the new covenant era of the Messianic kingdom. It was there, and the signs were there. The prophets had spoken about them, and all those things were happening, and they should have seen it. But beyond that particular local and temporal application, that is to his own generation, there is never a time, not even in this passage, that the Bible speaks of signs of the times in any other connection. It doesn't ever speak of signs of the times with reference to the second coming of Christ. You won't find the expression used in that connection at all. So when somebody says, well, don't you think we should be aware of the signs of the times? I'd have to say, well, what signs of what times? And if I would say, yes, we should be aware of the signs of the times, I guess I'd have to say, but on what biblical basis would I say so? Where does the Bible say we're supposed to be looking for signs of our own times? And the irony is that this very verse that blames these people for not recognizing the signs of the times calls them an evil and adulterous generation because of their fascination with signs. He says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Now, I would say that verse certainly applies to our age. Although Jesus wasn't directly applying it, that verse certainly has a transferable truth to any people who are fascinated with signs. I mean, Jesus is making sort of an axiomatic statement that applies across the board. It certainly applied to those people speaking to him. But if he simply says an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, he's speaking a truism that is seemingly applicable in more than one situation. And if we are to use this passage to comment on our own era, it is not the censure of those who don't recognize the signs of the times today that this passage should impact us with, but rather the wickedness of those who are fascinated with little else than finding signs. You know, when I heard that radio preacher say what I just mentioned a few minutes ago, not very long ago, I began thinking, I thought this way before, but I began to think more clearly about it. Not only does the Bible not say what that preacher is saying, that is, the Bible does not say that God's going to hold us accountable if we don't know the second coming is coming any moment. The Bible doesn't say we have to know any signs of any times in the end times. But furthermore, what kind of person would God be, and how would I understand his priorities and his program if that did matter to him? I mean, even though the Bible doesn't say what these guys said, suppose that in spite of the Bible's silence on the subject, that God really did feel this way, that God really does want us to know that the coming of the Lord is near, that God really does want us not to be ignorant of this fact. What does that tell me about God's program? First of all, I'd have to ask, why would it matter? Why would it matter to God whether I knew his coming was going to happen today or tomorrow or 1,000 years from now? What difference is it supposed to make? Now, most people say, well, if you know the coming of the Lord is near, it motivates you. It motivates you to get your act together. It motivates you to get prepared for the coming of the Lord. It motivates you to evangelize people. It may even motivate some people to get saved who aren't saved. I say, excellent, wonderful things, but shouldn't we do all those things whether Jesus is coming back tomorrow or whether he's coming back in 1,000 years from now? I mean, how is that different than our general obligation anyway? How would I behave differently if I knew Jesus was coming? And if I could identify what differences there'd be, that condemns the way I'm living now if I'm not living that way now. Shouldn't I live every day as if it could be my last? Whether Jesus comes back today or I get hit by a truck today and go to heaven, what's the difference? It could be my last day. Why should it matter? Is it God's way? Is God the kind of God who says, okay, I want all these half-hearted people who don't really love me to straighten up their act for a few years and pretend to be committed to me because they think the coming of the Lord is near, so I'll show them a lot of signs to get them aware of my coming. You know, if people only serve God because they've been told they might miss the rapture in the next couple of years if they don't get their act together, are these people really getting converted? Now, maybe you haven't lived long enough to know the answer to that. I do, because I was there in the early 70s when this was the message. The Jesus movement raked in hundreds of thousands of young people into a zealous, hardcore kind of discipleship lifestyle, faith lifestyle, zealous evangelism and so forth. And the principal message that was preached in every pulpit almost every night of the week was, Jesus is coming any moment. It could be today. Everything that's lining up in the political world is a fulfillment of what the Bible said would happen in the last times. We're seeing the signs of the times all around us. Get ready, because if you don't get converted tonight, the rapture may come before tomorrow morning, and you'll be here to face the Antichrist and 666 and the plagues of Revelation. And hey, a lot of people came in. They came running in. But you know what? All those political things that were happening back in the early 70s, which were supposedly fulfillments of prophecy and signs of the end times, none of those things are happening right now. In fact, very little, at least very few of them. Many of the things that were certainly heralded as signs of the end times are phenomena that passed and have been replaced by the opposite phenomena since then. I mean, the threat that Russia and the Soviet Union made to Israel, this was considered to be all, you know, Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about Gog and Magog coming down and sweeping in vast hordes on horseback, you know, and by the way, the Cossacks in Russia, you know, they're horseback troops, so that's got to be the fulfillment there. And we're living in the days Russia's going to do that thing. And then, of course, now, Russia doesn't seem to be anywhere near the kind of threat that she was 20 years ago to Russia, to Israel or anyone else. Now, one could argue, oh, well, the last chapter hasn't been written yet, and Russia may yet turn around and be a threat again. Maybe she will, but the fact remains that the fact that she was a threat back then didn't make it so. Because even if someday in the future Russia is going to do those things, it proves that the fact that Russia was there, menacing as she was no evidence that the second coming was imminent. If there's a dip in Russia's threatening career and then a rise again later, that simply shows that we were premature in identifying Russia's actions 20 years ago as signs that the coming of the Lord was imminent. And that's just the point I'm making. There's so many false alarms. First of all, what kind of God would even care to give warning to the half-hearted? He doesn't want the half-hearted. I mean, he wants everybody, but he doesn't want people to come on the basis of half-heartedness. He wants people to come wholehearted. And it seems to me when Jesus taught on the subject of signs, well, let's look over, we've talked about Matthew 24 in depth, but just those last verses from Matthew 24 seem to indicate a great deal the degree to which God will or will not warn the half-hearted about the imminence of his coming. Notice verse 36, Matthew 24:36, but of that day and hour no one knows. No, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only, but as the days of Noah were. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days of Noah before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. What? They won't know. There weren't warning shots fired over the heads of the people in Noah's day. Just Noah's preaching was all there was, just like the church's preaching is all the world has as warning now. Noah preached. They didn't listen. They didn't know. And it came and took them all away. There was no, there weren't some signs that alerted them that the flood was near. And that's how it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Then he says, but know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief would come, he would have watched, not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you, he's speaking to his disciples, when you do not expect him. Now the second coming of Christ is going to catch the world unexpectedly, like the flood caught the world in Noah's day unexpectedly, but the disciples are going to be caught unexpectedly too. The Son of Man's coming, he says to his 4 disciples who asked him about this subject, he's going to come at a time when you do not expect him. Even the believers will not know that it's coming. Then he says, who then is a faithful and a wise servant? In verse 45, Matthew 24:45. Who then is a faithful and a wise servant, whom the master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, finds so doing. Assuredly, I say to you, he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master's delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come in a day when he's not looking for him. No signs, no warnings. And at an hour that he is not aware of, and will cut him in two. Now, here's several things that Jesus says about his coming. First of all, it's going to be like the days of Noah. One thing about the days of Noah was the sinners were caught off guard. They didn't know until the day came that the flood came and swept them all. They were eating, drinking, getting married, just like life was going to go on forever. Not a clue that judgment was going to drop on them, the next morning. Then he says it's sort of like a thief coming to a house. The thief doesn't give advance warning. The thief who's going to come break into your house tomorrow night, he doesn't start sending you notes in the mail, saying, be ready, one of these nights I'm coming. It's really getting a lot closer, It's really getting close, better get ready. No, he doesn't give that kind of warning. The very reason Jesus chose the imagery of a thief coming is because he's trying to get that very point. You don't know when a thief is coming. Therefore, you have to be ready all the time. You have to be always ready in case he comes now. But he might not come now, and there's no signs that will let you know that this is the time and some other time is not the time. You've got to be ready at all times. And then he talks about two kinds of servants, both of whom are supposedly servants of God. And one servant is diligent, and his master comes back and finds him diligently doing his work. There's no suggestion that servant is diligent because he knew his master was about to come back. The servant was diligent because he was faithful. He was a faithful and wise servant, and he knew his master might come back at any time, so he always behaved in such a way that would not create embarrassment or condemnation to him if his master happened to appear. The foolish servant, though, got tired of waiting, and he began to go back to his old life again. Now, the suggestion is this is a person who has responded in some sense to the gospel. This person has become a servant of God in some capacity, but he gets tired of it. He got saved so that he could miss the judgment. Judgment didn't come, so he said, well, hey, this is going to take longer than I thought. Master's delaying his coming. I can get away with a little bit of having fun. Let's go out and eat and drink and get drunk and abuse our fellow servants, getting brawls and stuff. He says, and that servant is going to be very surprised when his master comes because he's not going to be looking for him. Now, it seems to me that Jesus indicated his return is not going to be preceded by signs. It's true that the earlier verses of Matthew 24 talk about earthquakes and famines in diverse places, but as you know from our previous coverage of that, I believe that earlier portion is speaking, and I don't see how anyone can see it otherwise if they compare it with parallel passages in Luke and so forth. That's not talking about the end times, that's talking about the destruction of the temple, which Jesus predicted and the disciples asked him about. Those signs of earthquakes and famines did happen before the destruction of the temple, but as far as his second coming, he says, no man knows the day and the hour of that day. And it's going to be like the days of Noah. It's going to be like a thief coming. It's going to be like a master who returns when the servants don't have a clue that he's coming. Therefore, it seems to me for people to be looking for signs, it does suggest that they are an evil and adulterous generation. I hate to say that, because that doesn't sound very kind to my friends who are dispensational, heaven gazers. But and let me make this clear. To say they're evil and adulterous would be more unkind than I would prefer to be. Actually, a lot of these people no doubt love the Lord. But one has to wonder, what kind of love for the Lord is it? That their zeal is based on the assumption that he's going to come back at any moment. What if they decided he wasn't going to come back at any moment? Would they still be zealous for God? Would they still love him? Why is it so all-fired important to them? When I first encountered postmillennialists, now I'm not a postmillennialist, but postmillennialists don't think Jesus is coming back anytime soon. They think the whole world's going to get Christianized first, and then it'll be another 1,000 years before Jesus comes back. And some of them don't even know if that 1,000 years is symbolic. Some of them don't know if Jesus is ever going to come back. This is strange stuff to me, to my ears. And of course, when I first heard it, I thought, well, what in the world? Why would anyone want to believe that? Why would anybody wish to embrace the notion that Jesus isn't even coming back? What a horrible thought that is. And then I thought about my response. Now, I'm not postmillennial, but I realized that my response was coming from kind of a poorly thought out place in that. Because the way I was thinking of it, while we're young, we always think we're immortal. We forget we're going to die. And the fact is, if Jesus didn't come back ever, of course he's going to, because he said he would, and I have no doubt that he will. But I'm just saying that even if he never came back, that's not going to prevent me from seeing him in the next few decades. If I die, I'm going to go see him. When I first thought, wow, if Jesus never came back, oh man, what a horrible life. But I realize that only makes sense if I expected to stay here forever anyway. If I'm leaving here within a few decades as it is, what does it matter to me if Jesus waits a few more decades or a few more million years? Every generation's just going to live one generation anyway. And everyone is living in the last generation, for themselves at least. And, his coming will only affect a particular generation in that they won't die. That generation of Christians won't die. No doubt we'd all like to be in that generation. But anyone who's reasonable realizes we got to count on dying just in case. Maybe our generation isn't the one. Maybe Jesus will wait another generation. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. He might just wait for them. Who knows? And if that is true, then we just got to face the fact we're going to die. But for some people, the second coming of Christ is all there is to keep them going, to keep them happy, and only the suggestion that it's awfully close, and everything around us is speaking of it. The signs are all in agreement about this. Jesus is coming any moment. It takes that kind of hype continually pumped into these people to keep them on the straight and narrow. And without it, they'll go out and beat their fellow servants and eat and drink with the drunken. Frankly, I'm not sure that keeping those people artificially afloat is a good idea, because if they will, in fact, go out and eat and drink with the drunken without that artificial hype, maybe that artificial hype is creating an artificial illusion of them being saved. They may have no actual commitment to Christ at all. I said I lived in the 70s, and I know from experience something. What I do know, I don't think I went so far as to say it, but you probably deduced it. I saw tens of thousands. There were actually hundreds of thousands. I didn't see them all, but I actually saw tens of thousands of people converted during the Jesus movement. But today, although my personal acquaintances among them were only a small cross-section of the whole movement, I would say it was a fair sampling, a random sampling of what you might find if you looked at the Jesus movement anywhere, in any group of them. I would say at least half of the people that got saved and swept into the Jesus movement that were my acquaintances are now back in the world. They're either totally non-Christian, or else they're Christians that are out eating and drinking with the drunken. When I say Christians, they're still in church, let's put it that way. Some have just renounced the church, so several of them are in homosexual lifestyles now. A lot of them have just been swallowed up by the world entirely. Others are still in church, but very much, sucked in by the world. Everything about their lifestyle is indistinguishable from the world, except that maybe they don't commit adultery, or murder. But then most worldly people don't either. The point is, a lot of people gave up. They were swept in to the movement because Jesus was supposed to come back any minute. But when he didn't, it says in Proverbs, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And their hope was deferred. It was put off. It didn't happen as soon as they thought. And so they decided they're tired of waiting. We're tired of this austere, forsake the world, take up your cross kind of business. Let's go back and enjoy some of this world since we're going to be here for a while maybe. Our Lord delays his coming. And frankly, I never could relate with that, because I never was following. I did expect Jesus to come any minute in the early 70s, but that was never my motivation for being a Christian. I was going to be a Christian whether he was coming or not. I believed in a pre-trib rapture, but I was determined I'd still be a Christian even if there was no pre-trib rapture. My eschatology was not the basis for my walk with God, and it isn't now either. But what I'm saying is, one might cautiously say, even today, that it's an evil and adulterous generation that's always seeking after signs. Why this obsession with signs? Now you might say, well, they just love the Lord. They're just eager to see him. Well, so am I. But we're all going to see him. Right now we're not supposed to be stargazing. We're supposed to be putting our hand to the task. We're supposed to put our hand to the plow and not look back. It's true that we need to... Well, you see, one of the problems is that Jesus used the metaphor of watching. Watch, because your Lord's coming. Watch. If the good men of the house had known what hour the people could come, he would have watched. Therefore, watch. And the modern word watch is what probably throws a lot of people off. Watching means to set your gaze on something today and, don't take your eyes off of it. Watch it. Like you watch television or you watch a movie or you watch your kid, play Little League or something. You watch it, your eyes are fixed on it. The word watch in Old English, and as Jesus used it, was the equivalent of fasting, only with reference to sleep. Fasting is going without food. Watching was going without sleep. And you'll often find Paul and others in the Scripture linking the two concepts of fastings and watchings. Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation, Jesus said to his disciples. What does watch mean there? Stay awake. when they fell asleep, he said, couldn't you watch with me for 1 hour? What are you supposed to be watching? You know, I mean, when they pray with their eyes closed, what are they watching? Watching means stay awake. Just like fasting means stay hungry. And, both of those things are linked in the Scripture with prayer and so forth. But when Jesus said, if the owner of the house had known when the thief would come, he would have watched, it means he would have stayed awake. And he says, therefore, you don't know when your master comes, so you watch. He doesn't mean keep your eyes on the clouds. Whether you're looking at the moment Jesus comes back or not won't make a difference as to whether you're taken up. I realize some people think that's a heresy to say, but if you're living for God, you'll be caught up to meet the Lord in the air when He comes, whether your eyes are set on the clouds that moment or not. In fact, you might even be asleep, who knows, physically. But to remain spiritually awake is, of course, what we're called to do. To not drift into spiritual slumber and lukewarmness is what He's warning against. And so watch doesn't mean, don't take your eyes off the sky. You'd be better off watching for the needs of the poor and the hungry and the lost and the needy. And they're not up there in the sky. And so what Jesus says about signs, ironically, verse 3 here is sometimes used to impose upon us some kind of phony obligation to be searching the newspapers, combing the news magazines, watching every TV broadcast to see if there's any evidence there of a fulfilled prophecy taking place, on the planet. And if we miss it, who knows? Maybe we'll be like that wicked servant who his Lord came and cut him in sunder with hypocrites because we didn't know, we missed one of those signs, There are people, there's whole ministries built, whole media ministries built on nothing other than updating their viewers on what happened this week in the news, that it can somehow be construed as a fulfillment of some obscure prophecy. Most of them don't understand the prophecies, as is evident by their way of applying them to modern events, but I mean, there literally are, and anyone who's watched Christian TV, as I have done very little, and anyone who's done it more than I have would know even better than I do how true that statement is. And to me, I find it silly and sad at the same time. And Jesus might have even said wicked and adulterous, seeking after signs. He was talking about the need for them to recognize Himself at His coming. And not to miss the fact that He was the Messiah that was prophesied, and that all the signs the prophet had spoken about as accompanying the advent of the Messiah's age were happening, and they were missing it they were seeing it, but they were refusing to let the evidence lead to what was the obvious truth. And that was His criticism of them. And it's hard to imagine how any such criticism could apply to those of us who are not particularly fascinated with alleged signs of the times happening about us. As far as I'm concerned, I hope the Lord comes back today. I'd love it if neither I nor my children ever had to die. But there's been generations of Christians, about 50 of them so far, since Christ, all of whom kind of would have liked to see Jesus come back in their time and their children and them never have to die. I'm certainly like-minded with the rest of the church in that respect. But I'm not like-minded with people who say, well, if Jesus doesn't come back soon, all is lost. Well, I'm not. I'm not lost, and my children aren't lost either. And I'm going to spend my time trying to make sure that fewer people are lost when He comes. But His second coming is a wonderful thing. We love His appearing. But we got no guarantees He's coming in our time. Certainly nothing that's happening in the world today is a sign that was predicted in the Bible. That's a sweeping statement, I know, but I can make that with a fair degree of certainty. And so looking for signs is not encouraged. Not by Jesus. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after signs. It's not going to be given any signs except the sign of the prophet Jonah. We already had that. Jesus died, was 3 days in the grave, and came out. That's a good enough sign. We don't need any more. Although I'm not saying God is not able or willing at times to give certain signs of various sorts. I think that individuals have sometimes asked God for a sign about this or that thing and have received such signs. I'm not, the problem here, these people were a wicked and adulterous generation, not so much because they observed and appreciated signs, but because they were demanding signs, they were obsessed with signs, and this fascination with signs had no corresponding obsession with truth, had no corresponding obsession with obeying God. It was simply a fascination with the spectacular, or in this case it might even have been challenging Jesus, saying, what you've shown us so far simply isn't enough. We remain unconvinced. Therefore, you're going to have to do something which they suspected maybe he couldn't do, so that if he couldn't do it, they'd be able to discredit him and find excuses for disbelieving in him. I don't know all that was going on in their minds, but I know he didn't have much sympathy for their request. Now, in fact, not only did he not have much sympathy for the request, in verse 2 where it says he answered,
deeply in his spirit. A little touch of eyewitness color to the narrative. Mark representing Peter's recollections about this when he wrote his gospel. Jesus, when they came to him with this sign, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit, like, oh, again, another, when am I going to get any rest from this kind of badgering, And at the end of this story in verse 4, when it says he left them and departed, Mark tells us he departed by boat. He got in a boat and crossed to the other side of the lake. Now, verse 5. And when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Now, it says they had forgotten to take bread. Matthew doesn't tell us exactly what their bread supply was like, but Mark does. In Mark 8:14, it says that they had no more than one loaf with them, so apparently they had one loaf left. But when the Bible talks about a loaf, remember, what they call a loaf is not what we call a loaf. To us, a loaf is about yay big and can feed a family of lunch and probably have some left over for dinner. Unless they're big family and big people, big appetites. But still, a loaf is a fairly large bit of bread to us. But a loaf to them was something more along the lines of a roll or a biscuit to us. And so they had extremely small quantity of bread. However, as the narrative goes on to insinuate, if you had one loaf, that was enough for Jesus to multiply. If they had no bread, it'd be curious to know how he'd create bread from nothing. No doubt he could, but it would have been a new kind of a thing they'd never seen him do. Maybe he'd turn rocks into bread. Who knows if they needed it. But the point is, they did have one loaf, and if they had fed, in fact, 4,000 with 7 loaves and 5,000 with 5 loaves, then he certainly ought to be able to feed 13, himself and his 12, with one loaf by the same kind of power. Now, this is an important point. He tells us in verse 5 by way of anticipation that they had forgotten to take bread, because that oversight on their part became the occasion of their misunderstanding something Jesus said. Verse 6 says, Then Jesus said to them, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Mark's version says of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. I don't know if there's 3 leavens of Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herod, or whether the leaven of Herod is the same as the leaven of the Sadducees. Certainly the Sadducees and the Pharisees didn't have exactly the same problems. Their problems were different from each other, but in one sense they were the same. They both rejected Christ, and both for inadequate reasons. One because of their religious traditions, the Pharisees, and the other because of their political aspirations. Both politics and religion can get in the way of receiving Christ, and both of them can seem all important to those who are occupied with them, and it can prevent people from becoming believers. Now, Jesus said, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. If the Sadducees' leaven is related in some sense to their political, their commitment to political expediency, then the reference in Mark to the leaven of Herod would probably be identical to it, because Herod and the Herodians were certainly committed to a political expediency rather than truth. But verse 7 says, And they reasoned among themselves. When he said this, the disciples reasoned, saying, It's because we've taken no bread. But when Jesus perceived it, he said to them, O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you've brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember? Actually, this do you not yet understand or remember in verse 9 has a much longer counterpart in Mark. In Mark 8:17 and 18, he says, Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? So it's the same statement, but lengthened in Mark, apparently abbreviated in Matthew more like. Is your heart still hardened, he said to them? Do you have eyes and don't see, and ears and don't hear? Here he simply says, Do you not yet understand? Or remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up? Now here Jesus just summarizes the events in the past, but in Mark's version he actually asked them, how many baskets did you take up after we fed the 4,000? They said, 7. And he said, well, how many did you take up after we fed the 5,000? 12. Okay, then he said what we have here in verse 11, how is it that you do not understand? That I did not speak to you concerning bread, but that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine, or we should say the teaching, of the Pharisees and Sadducees. It seems perhaps strange to us that when Jesus would say, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the first thing the disciples would think is, it's because we have no bread. If they were taking Jesus to mean, natural leaven, such as was used for bread, which is obviously the connection they were making, we brought no bread, still, even if he were speaking of bread, it's hard to know how his statement would be relevant to the fact they brought no bread. Perhaps they were perplexed by this themselves, and it seems like the only possible meaning they could have imputed to his words was that since they brought no bread, they were obviously going to have to make some. They're going to have to acquire some. And, these don't buy any leaven that the scribes and Sadducees have had their hands on. Who knows, maybe they're poisoning it or something, you can't trust those guys. But the disciples felt somehow that Jesus' words were some kind of a rebuke for them for not having the foresight to bring bread. Now, apparently it was a lack of foresight on their part rather than simply they had no opportunity. Because it says in verse 5 they'd forgotten to take bread. The idea would seem to be that it was their duty. Ordinarily, if they hadn't forgotten, they would have acquired some bread for the journey, but they'd forgotten. Therefore, they were somewhat smitten by a sense of having neglected a responsibility. Jesus had been probably in silent reverie while crossing the lake and having said nothing, and now arriving at the other side, he bursts out with this one statement that is hard for them to understand, and since what was on their mind was the bread they had forgotten to bring, of course any reference to anything like bread, like a reference to leaven, would strike them as probably some kind of a rebuke to them for not having brought bread. And so they reasoned among themselves, oh, he's saying that because we didn't bring bread. Anyway, Jesus points out it doesn't really matter about bread. Remember, you only had 5 loaves and we fed 5,000. You only had 7 loaves and we fed 4,000. How could you think that I had any concern whatsoever about how much bread you had? You have 1 loaf, as it turns out, and should that not be enough for me to multiply, as you've only recently seen me multiply loaves, how could you think for a moment that my concern was about the amount of bread we have or don't have? The problem is, still thinking naturally. Now, what did he mean by the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Well, it says in verse 12, they understood after this that he was not talking about the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine or the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They were to watch out for the teachings of these men, or for the ideas of these men. In another place, in Luke 12:1, in a different context and different setting, Jesus said, beware of the leaven of the scribes and Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So he identified the leaven of the Pharisees, at least in Luke 12:1, as hypocrisy. However, here, the leaven of the Pharisees and of Sadducees is their teachings. Now, some may find this troublesome, and like we're supposed to really nail this down. What is the leaven? Is it hypocrisy? Is it the teachings? What is it? Well, first of all, the word leaven makes for a good analogy for more than one thing. We know that Paul indicated that the fornication that was taking place in the church of Corinth was like leaven in the lump. He said they had to get the leaven out of there. Because a little leaven would spoil the whole lump. Jesus, prior to this, in Matthew 13, had said the kingdom of God is itself like leaven, put into a lump. So it's quite clear that leaven was a very flexible metaphor that could be used of anything that was in some sense like leaven. And namely, of course, the main quality of leaven is that it needn't have a very strong representation initially. It can be a little pinch of yeast put into a much larger element, a lump of 3 measures of dough, Jesus said in Matthew 13. And yet the whole lump will be affected by it. The leaven may not be great in volume, but it has a great impact. A little bit of it can have a powerful impact on its element or its environment that it's inserted into. And sin is like that. The kingdom of God is also like that. Although sin and the kingdom of God are two things that you couldn't find two things more contrary to each other than that, but both of them have this quality that though the kingdom of God began small, it was going to have a tremendous impact. Sin is that way too. You let a little sin in the church, it'll have an impact disproportionate to its volume. Also, hypocrisy, which on one occasion, Luke 12:1, he called the leaven of the Pharisees was hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is that way too. You get a little bit hypocritical, you compromise your integrity a little bit, you fake it one time, you pretend, you just allow yourself to compromise that integrity just a little bit. Eventually, if you get away with it at least, it gets easier to do it the next time. Eventually your whole life is a sham. Eventually you find that you can get credit for things you didn't do, you can get respect that you don't deserve simply by misrepresenting things a little bit, retelling a story a little differently than it really happened or whatever, and eventually this gets to be a thing that permeates the whole character. Eventually you can just become a liar all the time, or live a lie. Anyway, it's like leaven. They start out small, but it has a very powerful and increasing impact on the life. Here, the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees are what the leaven is that Jesus is referring to, which means, of course, the things they teach. And I don't know that he had to be too specific. Almost everything about their teachings was problematic. The Pharisees taught that the traditions of the elders were important, and they weren't. But if you allow for that, that gets you on the slippery slope into total traditionalism to the point where your traditions lead you to not even do the will of God, not even to, you make void the commandments of God by your traditions, as earlier in chapter 15 Jesus pointed out had happened to the Pharisees. It just comes a little bit by majoring on minors, a little bit. Starts out small. You begin to make something a big issue that's not a big issue. You start to include a little bit of human teaching into the mix of your religion. And then, where do you stop? Once you've included one, once you've broken down that what should be an insurmountable barrier, that wall between the Word of man and the Word of God, which there should be a huge wall there. I mean, there should be a thick, dark line that everyone can see when it's been crossed, when you're talking the Word of God or the Word of man, because they are of entirely different quality and species from each other. As soon as you begin that line to be crossed a little bit, eventually there's a whole crowd of human ideas that flood in. And eventually the sight is lost entirely of what's of God and what's of man. The leaven of the Sadducees and of Herod, if I would be correct, I don't know whether I am or not, but I suspect that this is referring to their tendency to compromise for the sake of political expediency. Because that's what the Sadducees did. That's what Herod did. This, too, is something that if you allow yourself to do it, to be a man-pleaser for the sake of advantage, to begin to value the things like political power and the privileges that come with that, to begin to get a taste for that, just a little bit of that, can intoxicate a person and addict you to it. And eventually your whole life is governed by a commitment to those values, that, whatever is politically expedient, whatever gives you more of that nectar that you've had a taste of power over other people, or simply the power and privilege of position. Those kinds of things mattered to the Sadducees. That's why they compromised and corroborated with the Romans. That's why Herod did. He was half Jew. But, again, Christians can make that same mistake today too. Jesus said to beware of it. When Jesus said beware, it's very seldom that Jesus would say beware. There's not very many things that Jesus told, many vices that Jesus said to beware of. He didn't say ever, beware of becoming a murderer, or beware of being an adulterer, or beware of becoming a thief, or a kidnapper, or a homosexual. He never said beware of those things. Now, that doesn't mean those things aren't important. But he did say, beware of hypocrisy, the leaven of the Pharisees. Also in Luke 12, a little later, he says, beware of covetousness. And the things that he says to beware of are things that we need special warnings about. Although murder and adultery and kidnapping and grand larceny are all terrible crimes and terrible sins, there's no great danger that a person will commit those things and still think they're a good Christian. Those are not sneaky vices. When those are in your life, you know they're there. When you're a murderer, you know you're a murderer. When you've done some heinous crime, you're not unaware of it. If you're an alcoholic, a drug addict, Jesus doesn't say beware of these vices. Why? Because you know they're there. You don't have to be warned. They're visible. They're clearly visible. The things that he said beware of are the things that sneak up on you. A little bit of hypocrisy, a little bit of covetousness, a little bit of man-pleasing, a little bit of traditionalism. These things, they just creep right in. You hardly even notice they're there. But they're like leaven. A little bit of it leavens a lump. Once they come in, they do tend to take over. And they do so from the inside. They do so fairly unnoticeably. And for that reason, he reserves such warnings as begin with the word beware for such things as those. Things that you might succumb to without knowing you've succumbed. Things that you might live in without knowing you're not a good Christian anymore. Without knowing that you're living in carnality and in disobedience to God. People who are alcoholic and drunkards out there, there's no question, whether they're living in obedience to God or not. But hypocrites, the church is full of them. Or at least that's what I'm told. And man-pleasers and covetous, that's all there. And Jesus said, beware of those things. Now, verse 13, we enter upon a significant turning point. What begins in verse 13 runs throughout the remainder of the chapter. I sincerely doubt that we would have sufficient time in this session to go through the end of the chapter, so we'll go through a portion of it, and we'll take as much as we can. But in verse 13, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." That means son of Jonah. Must have been Simon's father's name. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he commanded his disciples that they should not tell anyone that he was Jesus the Christ, at least for the time being. After the Mount of Transfiguration, which is in the next chapter, as they were coming down the mountain, he also told them, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen up here until the Son of Man is risen from the dead." So there was obviously some kind of a time limitation to this command. Obviously, after Jesus rose from the dead, they were supposed to go out and tell people he was Jesus the Christ. But at that point, he said, let's just let people discover that for themselves if they will. Now, what do we have here? Caesarea Philippi was not in Israel. Jesus was still staying outside the country, probably because of the massive crowds that were attracted to him every time he set foot on Jewish soil. And he went up into the mountains to the northeast of Israel, having crossed over, and Caesarea Philippi was near the headwaters of the Jordan River, which originated up in the mountains, as I say, to the northeast of Israel. The Jordan River ran the full length of the land of Israel as an eastern border, but it began up in these mountains, in this place, or near this place, called Caesarea Philippi. The name was a fairly recent name for the place. It had been known by many other names before. Many of the previous names of this place had been commemorative of some pagan god. For instance, the place was once called Panius, which was after the Roman god Pan. And there were other pagan names for the place previous to that. But Caesarea Philippi, the name of it actually was after Caesar and Philip. Philip was one of the Herods. Herod Philip had named this place after himself and after his ruler, Caesar. And so it was Caesarea Philippi, the place of Caesar and of Philip. Now, in this region, there were tremendous shrines because of the history of the place. It had been a place of worship for many false gods, and the shrines were still visible around, and it was up in this region that Jesus postured himself in this environment and said, "Now, who do you say I am?" as if to set himself in contrast with all the other gods that had been worshipped at that very site. Now, Jesus had gotten off alone with his disciples to get away from the crowds, I'm sure. And no doubt, just so he could ask them the question, who do you say that I am? Now, the disciples had earlier expressed their faith in Jesus. In fact, the very day that Peter first met Jesus, in John chapter 1, Andrew, his brother, said, we found Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. And so we know that this was not the first time that the disciples expressed some kind of faith in the Messiahship of Jesus. But it seemed to cause Jesus great pleasure to hear Peter say it at this time. And no doubt that is because the disciples had found it easy to believe he was the Christ when they were riding the crest of the wave of popularity, when 5,000 and 4,000 were following him. But would they still believe it if they were told that he was going to die and be unpopular? And that's actually what he ended up telling them in the very next verse beyond the ones we read. In verse 21, from that time Jesus began to show the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from chief elders and so forth, and die and rise again in 3 days. Their faith in him as Messiah was not something new, but it had been previous to this bolstered by very encouraging circumstances. Great multitudes following him, the appearance of great potential for him to take over the government and so forth with multitudes behind him. But that wasn't what Jesus was doing. In fact, he was about to tell them for the first time plainly that he was going to die. And he wanted to secure from them a confession away from the group dynamics of the crowds that were saying, surely this is the Messiah, surely this is the Messiah, and get them off alone, cause them to reflect a little more without the crowds, encouraging them to see this way, and just hear, how do they feel about Jesus now? Now, when he came up to this place, he didn't ask them what they thought, but he said, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Now, the question can be raised, I suppose, was Jesus wanting information? Didn't he already know what people were saying about him? And if he didn't know, how did the disciples know? How did he expect them to know? Well, possibly, because when Jesus was teaching, the apostles may have been among the crowd overhearing the comments people were making to each other, which would not be audible to Jesus from where he was sitting. Or maybe from their recent outreach when they'd gone out to many cities where Jesus had not been with them. Maybe he's trying to get he's canvassing for public opinion about, what kind of reaction they met when they preached about him in those towns. And, who do people think we are? Who do people think I am? And the answer they gave was varied, which shows there was tremendous public confusion over who Jesus was. They said, some say John the Baptist. Well, we know who said that. Herod said that. When Herod heard about Jesus' miracles after he had killed John the Baptist, he said, this is John the Baptist, he's raised from the dead, he's come back. Apparently others felt that Herod might have been right about this. But that probably wasn't the prevailing opinion. They said, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah. Others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. It's interesting that they didn't say, and some say you're the Messiah. Now, there had been, previous to this, times when people were saying, surely this is the Son of David, surely this is the prophet who was to come, all of which were different ways of saying, surely this is the Messiah. But it would seem possibly that conviction was dying down. Now, we remember that after Jesus fed the multitudes the first time, and spoke to them about the bread of life, that most of them forsook him, even many of his disciples, it says, forsook him and didn't walk anymore with him. And it's possible that there was, at this point, a growing disillusionment with Jesus on the part of the crowds. Now, he had had two very excellent chances to seize power and show that he was the Messiah and drive the Romans out. Once, when some 15,000 people were with him, and a second time when a slightly smaller crowd, with 4,000 men plus women and children with him, and he had done nothing about it. He had not seized the day. He had not seized the opportunity. And therefore people were maybe beginning to scratch their heads and say, well, maybe he's really not the Messiah since he's not acting like the Messiah. Even John the Baptist had his doubts, although he had previously strongly affirmed that Jesus was the Messiah. And so they were saying, well, but he's got to be someone special. Apparently he's not the Messiah, but maybe he's Elijah. Elijah's supposed to come first. Or Jeremiah. He fed the multitudes. Jeremiah is expected to come and do so with the manna. Maybe this is who he is. But the response of the disciples, if it represents the most up-to-date opinion that they had gleaned from the crowds, would demonstrate that the crowds were not, at least not en masse, recognizing Jesus as Messiah at this point. They were starting to give him lesser titles. And that suggests, since we have earlier read that people were being sure that he was the Messiah, that there was some disillusionment, that his popularity was waning, that people were backing off, keeping him at arm's length a little more. And this could be the very phenomenon that caused Jesus to want to check out his disciples and say, what about you? Remember when the multitudes walked no more with him? In John chapter 6, he turned to the 12 and said, will you go away also? This, no doubt, was a frequent concern of his. It's easy for the disciples to want to stay with him as long as he's the most popular guy in the country, as long as there's power and privilege and so forth attached to it. But what about in the wake of his diminishing popularity? What about people who are, people aren't saying he's the Messiah anymore? At least the disciples weren't hearing that kind of talk anymore. Much lesser status was now being applied to him in the public opinion. And, Jesus, no doubt, thought, well, I know these disciples not too long ago would stand the Messiah, but would they still say so? Is this disillusionment taking its toll on them too? Will they also go away? And so after he finds out what the crowds have said, he said, but who do you say that I am? Now, we don't hear any of the other disciples speaking up. And I don't know if it's because they didn't share Peter's opinion. I think they probably did. Remember, it was Peter also who spoke up when he said, will you 12 also go away? And Peter spoke up for the rest and said, where will we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. It's clear that Peter felt himself capable of speaking for the group. And that might not have been arrogance on his part. It might be that the group did confide in Peter. That in conversations among themselves, Peter certainly did have his finger on the pulse of what they were all thinking, and it even might have been sort of either self-appointed or appointed by them as a spokesman of where they stood. So when Jesus said to them in John 6, will you also go away? Peter said, well, who are we going to go to? We're going to stay with you. And on this occasion, Jesus says to them as a group, who do you say I am? And Peter speaks up and says, well, the official opinion among us is, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, this was not a new thing, as I pointed out before. The apostles, several of them, had made this very comment about Jesus in previous stories we've read, that he was the Messiah. But what was important about this was the first time that they had to make this confession when it had ceased to be the popular opinion. It was, as I say, easy to make this confession when everybody agreed and when the evidence seemed to look that way. But now things were the movement was dying down. Jesus was becoming less popular. Fewer people were willing to suggest that maybe this is the Messiah. But the disciples were still hanging in there, and that's the point. And that's why Jesus said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. Now, in saying that flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, of course, flesh and blood means human beings. Yet Jesus is not denying that human beings had told Peter this very fact, because in fact Peter had first been told this by his own brother Andrew. If you look over at John chapter 1, we'll see the very first time that Peter became aware of Jesus' existence was from the testimony of his own brother Andrew, who had met Jesus previous to Peter doing so. And it says, verse 40, John 1:40, one of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Now, when Jesus looked at him, he said, you are Simon, the son of Jonah, Simon Bar-Jonah. You shall be called Cephas, which is translated a stone. Now, the next day, Philip and Nathanael come to Jesus. And notice what Nathanael says in verse 49. Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. King of Israel is obviously a reference to his messianic role. And Son of God. Now, what did Peter say in Caesarea Philippi? You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. The very same thing that was said practically when these disciples first met him. So it's not as if this is some late-breaking news with Peter and he'd just suddenly gotten the revelation. He'd heard it. Other disciples previous to himself had even said it in his hearing, in his presence. So why does Jesus say, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, when in fact he had heard it from human sources? Well, the reason I think is this, and this is a very important point to understand, that there's a great difference between hearing something about Jesus from another person and having it revealed to you by God, even though both may exist in your life. It's not the least bit uncommon for people to be raised in a Christian home and hearing all the true things about Jesus from their parents or from Sunday school, from some source, and yet not having the revelation themselves. They might even be able to mouth the right words. They might even think they're believers, but they don't really have it in their heart. And when persecution comes, or when it's unpopular to profess these things, suddenly that which they only know by hearsay ceases to be worth suffering for, ceases to be worth remaining loyal to. That which really is a second-hand faith they picked up from their parents or someone else rather than having it known to them. Now, the same people very frequently do come to know Jesus. That would be my experience. I first heard about Jesus from my parents. Later in my life, I came to know him myself. And Jesus could say, you know, you're blessed because flesh and blood has not revealed who I am to you, but my Father has revealed it to you. He could say that to me because even though flesh and blood, namely my parents, had first told me who Jesus was, not only did I hear it from them, but also from God. In fact, the real revelation didn't come from people, it came from God. My parents could tell me, but they couldn't reveal it to me. Only God could really give me that inward revelation, which is essential to really being converted, and to really being, to having the conviction yourself, and owning it for yourself, so you no longer have a second-hand belief that you borrowed from someone else, but that it's your own, because you've now had it revealed to you. Remember when Jesus spoke to the woman at the well? She ran off to the neighborhood, or to the village, and said, I found the one who's the Messiah. Come. You know, he told me everything I ever did. They came, Jesus taught them for 2 days, and the last thing we read about the people of that village, they came to the woman and said, now we believe not because you told us, but because we've heard him for ourselves. And we know that he is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the one who is to come. Now, they first heard from her, and apparently they believed her because they came to listen to him for a couple of days. But having had a personal encounter with him, their belief rested upon now something they could own for themselves, something that was perfect, clear to them from their own experience and not just from what someone had told them. And there comes a time in every person's life who's ever been told by other people who Jesus is, and that's all of us who ever become Christians, that we have to go beyond the point where we're believing because we have faith in the person who told us, to the point where God has really revealed it to us personally. And I think the reason Jesus rejoiced at this particular occasion was because Peter's confession demonstrated that his faith was not based strictly on what he'd heard from flesh and blood, but he had that other, more important revelation from the Father, and that was clear by the fact that even though many people were falling away like flies, staying away in droves, that Jesus still was holding fast, you know? I mean, Peter was still holding fast, and he said, I still believe you. We still believe that you're the Son of God. We still believe you're the Messiah. A lot of things you've been doing have been causing a lot of people to doubt that, but we don't doubt it. We still believe it. And Jesus said, good. That proves that you've got something more than a second-hand religion. Your belief in me is not based on what someone else has told you, because if it was, you'd be saying right now that I'm John the Baptist or Jeremiah or Elijah or whatever is the current opinion. But your opinion is not dependent on what the popular opinion is. You see more than they do, and you see it for deeper reasons, because you've had it revealed to you by the Father. And that's what Jesus says. And then he goes on. In verse 18 it says, I also say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Now, we probably won't get beyond this verse today. We'll talk about the keys of the kingdom and so forth next time, I guess. But let's talk about this verse. You are Peter. Now, again, this wasn't news to Peter, although that wasn't the name his parents gave him. He was Simon, and that's what he calls him in verse 17. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. That's his given name. That was the name his parents gave him. But he said, I want you to remember what I've called you. I've called you Cephas. Cephas, of course, is the Aramaic, but Peter, or Petros in the Greek, is the equivalent, which means a stone. He says, I want you to, you're not just Simon Bar-Jonah. You're not just the man that you were from your, by natural birth. You were Simon Bar-Jonah. You were the son of Jonah. Now you're the son of God. Now you're one of God's own kids. You've got a new identity. You were Simon, so named by your parents. Your ancestry was traced through your father Jonah. But now I want you to identify yourself as a new person. Because of the revelation you have from my Father, it no longer is significant what you gain from man. whether it was insight or whether it was your name and your heredity. But what matters now is that you have received revelation from the Father. You have a new identity symbolized by this new name I'm giving to you. I'm going to call you a stone. I'm going to call you Petros. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. This has occasioned a great deal of controversy. What is the rock upon which the church is based? Now, the Roman Catholic Church feels that the passage very clearly teaches that the rock is Peter. Protestants, perhaps in overreacting to Roman Catholicism, have come up with ideas that seem less acceptable than the Catholics do. The Protestant view that I have always heard from my youth was that he was not talking about Peter as the rock, but he was talking about Peter's confession was the rock. That Peter's confession and belief that Jesus was the Christ, Son of God, that confession was the rock upon which the church would be built, and the true church would be built upon those who could make that same confession, because they too had the spiritual revelation that Peter had. Well, that might fit well into Protestant theology, but it doesn't really sound very much like what Jesus said. It would certainly be sort of an abstract application of the words. Not that abstract applications are not valid, but it's not the easiest meaning to get out of the statement. Others have said, and there with somewhat more validity, I think, that the rock is Jesus himself. Now, to support this, the point is pointed out that the word Peter and the word rock in this verse are not exactly the same in the Greek. Peter, the name Peter, is Petros, and the word rock upon this rock is Petra. And it is said that Petros means a small movable stone, and Petra means a huge rock like the city of Petra, which was carved out of a big mountain of rock, something immovable. And so they say what Jesus was doing is sort of making a play on words and a contrast at the same time. Saying, Peter, you are a little rock. But then, perhaps with a gesture toward himself, and saying, and upon this rock, this big rock, this immovable rock, namely myself, I'll build my church. Now, let me critique this view a little bit. Frankly, I think the view may be correct, but I don't think it can be defended on the basis of the Greek choice of words. It is true that Petros means a small movable stone, and Petra means a large immovable stone, but to make that point and to say, therefore, Peter cannot be the rock, and to try to refute Catholicism that way doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because, simply for this reason, Petra is the normal word for rock. It's a feminine word in the Greek. But there's never been in history any knowledge of any other case of the word rock being applied to a human being. I think I've mentioned that before. Rock is simply not a nickname that is known from antiquity to have been applied to humans. As far as I know, Jesus is the first person to apply that word as a name to a person, rock. However, since the word rock in the Greek is a feminine word, and yet the name is being applied to a male, Jesus calls him by the masculine form of the word, Petros. Petros and Petra are male, masculine, and feminine forms of the word rock. And for that reason, the Catholics argue it is still possible to see Peter as the rock here. It's true that Petra is the more normal word to use for rock, but it couldn't be used as a name, so Jesus had to make it Petros in order to reflect the masculinity of the person to whom the name was given. And therefore, the difference between Petra and Petros is not an issue. That Jesus is still saying, Peter, you're the rock, and on you, the rock, I'm going to build my church. However, if we ask, is there any witness from the rest of the Bible as to what is the rock upon which the church is built, it would seem like the answer would have to be Jesus, not Peter, because the rest of the New Testament is absolutely silent about Peter being the rock. Now, it's clear that Peter was dominant among the apostles in the book of Acts, at least early on, until about chapter 12 or so. Peter is in Acts, Peter is the dominant spokesperson, but that's a different thing than saying that the church is built upon him. If you look at what the Bible actually says about what the church is built upon, we'll see that it always refers to Jesus as the foundation and the stone upon which the church is built. And that would seem to suggest that those who wrote the rest of the New Testament did not identify Peter as the rock upon which the church is built, nor see it as important to emphasize it if they did believe it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 1 Corinthians 3, Paul's talking about the church in the metaphor of a building being built. as he frequently does, and Peter does that too in his own epistle. But in 1 Corinthians 3:11, he says, "For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, and straw, each one's work will become manifest." Now it's talking about the foundation of the church. He says there's no other foundation of the church than one, the original one, Jesus. Now, if you look over at Isaiah, which is quoted a number of times, this passage in Isaiah is quoted a number of times in the New Testament, but I'll just show it to you in the original, and then however many times it may be quoted in the New Testament is not important to our point right now. In Isaiah 28 and verse 16, 28:16 says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion a stone for a foundation." Now in the New Testament, the imagery of Zion is taken up and applied to the church. So God lays in Zion, in His church, a stone for a foundation. That certainly sounds like the stone upon which the church is built, if it's a foundation stone. He says it's a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not act hastily. Now, Isaiah doesn't tell us who this stone is. For all we know from reading Isaiah, maybe it's Peter. I mean, in fact, if we had only read Isaiah and then read Matthew 16, we might say, okay, Isaiah said that God's laying in the church a stone for a foundation. Jesus appears to be telling Peter, he is that stone. Upon this rock I'll build my church. However, if you turn to Peter's own commentary in 1 Peter, we'll find that he quotes this passage from Isaiah, which means that he's got in mind the whole subject of what is the foundation of the church and the rock upon which the church is built. If you'll look in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning with verse 4, Peter says, "Coming to Him," that is Jesus, "as a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." Now we've had stones here. One living stone and then another living stone. The first living stone is Jesus. The other living stone are the Christians. Which is Peter? Well, Peter doesn't single himself out for special attention at all in this discussion of stones. And the imagery is of the building of the church. Now, verse 6. "Therefore it is also contained in Scripture," and he quotes the Isaiah passage we looked at, "Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he who believes in Him will be by no means put to shame." There can be no doubt that he's talking about Jesus here, because in verse 7 he says, "Therefore to you who believe, He is precious." You see, the chief cornerstone is elect, precious in Isaiah. And Peter says, certainly Jesus, to us who believe, He is precious. He is a precious cornerstone. Now look what he goes on. "But to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." Now that is a quote from Psalm 118 and verse 22. Jesus quotes it also in Matthew, and it's one of those verses that's quoted a number of times in the New Testament also. But Peter quotes two scriptures about stones from the Old Testament. One is from Isaiah 28:16. Actually, he quotes three because there's another one later on in verse 8. But in these two verses, he quotes from Isaiah 28:16, and then he quotes from Psalm 118, verse 22. Both of them speak of stones. Both of them, in Peter's usage, refer to Jesus. And both of them speak of foundations of the church, upon which the church is built. So, it seems to me that Peter indicates that he believes the church is built on Jesus, not on himself. If Peter believed for a moment that he himself was the foundation stone of the church, upon which the church was built, he didn't give us a clue. Not the slightest hint, not a clue at all. In fact, what he said would seem to refute that. Because it's not as if he's silent on the subject altogether of stones and foundations and what the church is built on. It's not as if it's just a subject that goes unaddressed. He takes pains to address it, as few other biblical writers do, and neglects altogether to reference any special status that he has in this regard, but simply points out Jesus is the one. He's the stone upon which the church is built. And based on these other things in Paul's writings and Peter's writings and so forth, it would seem to me that the apostles understood Jesus' remark to Peter, not to say that Peter was the stone upon which the church was built, but that Jesus was. So the Protestant interpretation may well fit the facts of Scripture better than the Catholic one. Although I would not want to press the difference between Petra and Petros as far as some Protestants do in trying to make the point, because there's a question as to whether that Greek difference is significant. Now, as far as what is meant when he said the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church, I'm afraid we'll have to